Good afternoon, this is Ajahn John. Today I am going to continue talking about the subject of radical Islam. Remember, in my last video I discussed religious violence, and today I'm going to talk about one way in which people get involved in this violence. This is called radicalisation, where an ordinary Muslim person adopts very extreme religious ideas, such as jihad, G-I-J-I-H-A-D, which is interpreted by many Muslims to mean they should kill non-Muslims, especially people who may have insulted Islam. You're going to hear a BBC news broadcast in which the British Prime Minister David Cameron criticises Muslim leaders in the UK for not doing more to prevent young people becoming radicalised. And also you will be hearing several other people talking about this subject. You're going to hear some Muslim leaders and ordinary Muslim people talking about this problem and their experience of being a Muslim in the UK and their interpretation of why some people become radicalised and how to deal with this problem. The news clip is around 12 minutes long. You will find some of it difficult to understand because they speak quite quickly, but I will summarise some of the points and also discuss in more detail in my next video. So let's listen to the BBC.
Singer from that country. More from him later. But we begin with the British Prime Minister David Cameron. Today he tried to direct the focus of the arguments being made about the radicalisation of young Muslims in the UK to families whose children go to fight and families in the communities from which those fighters come. He is saying, don't just blame others for what these children do. Look to yourselves as well.
How does someone who's had all the advantages of a British or European schooling, a loving family, the freedom and equality that allow them to be who they want to be, turn into a tyrannical, murderous, evil regime? There are, of course, many reasons, and to tackle them we have to be clear about them. I'm clear that one of the reasons is that there are people who hold some of these views, who don't go as far as advocating violence, but who do buy into some of these prejudices, giving the extreme Islamist narrative weight and telling fellow Muslims, you are part of this. This paves the way for young people to turn simmering prejudice into murderous intent.
So what can be done to stop families losing their children to the so-called Islamic State in this way? Here's the Prime Minister again.
If we are to really tackle this threat, we need to confront extremism in all its forms, violent and non-violent, to stop our young people sliding from one to the other. We also need to be clear about the ideology's methods. It may be medieval in its outlook, but it is modern in its tactics, with the internet as the main tool to spread its warped worldview. Being clear about these things will allow us to develop the powers we need to root out this poison. And being clear where responsibility does and doesn't lie is also key. Too often we hear the argument that radicalisation is the fault of someone else. That blame game is wrong, and it's dangerous. By accepting the finger-pointing, whether it's at agencies or authorities, we're ignoring the fact that radicalisation starts with the individual, and we'd be in danger of overlooking many of the ways we must try and stop it at source. We need to treat the causes, not just the symptoms.
And that was the British Prime Minister David Cameron. Now, we're obviously concentrating for the moment on the remarks of the British Prime Minister about British young people going to fight, but the fact is that this is not just a British phenomenon. There are people from countries all over the world going to join in various jihadi activities on various battlefronts. Here are some BBC-gathered statistics spelling out exactly how many people, the estimates at least say, how many people are going to fight jihad from various countries around the world.
Belgium, 440.
France, 1,200.
Germany, 600.
Sweden, 150 to 180.
United Kingdom, 500 to 600.
Bosnia, 330.
China, 300.
Russia, 800 to 1,500.
Tunisia, 1,500 to 3,000.
United States, 100.
Well, to discuss this, I was joined by Hidi Rahman, British businesswoman, and also Kalsoum Bashir from a pressure group on these issues. And first to Hidi Rahman, what does she make of the Prime Minister's comments?
I think there's certainly a contingent within the Muslim community whereby there are people who support and advocate what ISIS is doing. So absolutely, yes, I'd say that he is correct. But I'd also say that there's an element within the community who don't support what ISIS is doing, think it's wrong, but are afraid of speaking up because the demonstration of the religion happens in absolutes. You're either with us or against us. So if you do put your head above the parapet, are you at risk of being accused of having a lack of faith, being against people, or worse still, being accused of being a non-believer, and then being ostracised from your community? I think that's a big risk, and I think one can't dissociate the religious from the cultural element.
So if you were to separate these out, is it religion or is it identity? Which is the more important?
I think it's both. It's interesting that he said, you've got these young children who grow up in these loving families and can be who they want to be. They can't necessarily, or they don't feel as though they can be who they want to be because they're not quite sure where they belong. I think that's the element, is that, from my own experience, I grew up not fitting into the white community in which I grew up. There was an Asian community not far away from us, not fitting in there either. So you're kind of straddling these two environments. You're living on the periphery all the time. So you think, okay, where do I belong? And the one thing about the religion is it transcends culture, language, everything. It is one place where you can absolutely, unequivocally belong. And people are drawn to that.
Kalsoum Bashir, you've been listening to that. You're with Inspire, which is an organisation that tries to cope with these issues. What do you think of what you've just heard?
I think I would agree with it wholeheartedly. Our work has taken us right across the country. We think that women are doubly vulnerable because what they're telling us when we're telling them the counter-narrative to what ISIS are using and telling them how Quranic verses are used out of context, the women are telling us, we didn't know this, we weren't taught this within our mosques, within our religious framework. So when young women aren't equipped to challenge that narrative, they are even more vulnerable to going online because there are no places for them within the community. The mosques within the country, I would say, are very, very inadequate at meeting the needs of women, let alone young women that are looking for social and recreational spaces where they can explore these questions around identity. So if these women don't have that counter-narrative, don't have a voice, are not being heard, how then can they answer their questions? As one mother said to us last week, she said, we've got somebody in our family who's been killed in Syria. He was killed after a week. My son is now asking me, Mummy, is the best way to get to heaven to go to Syria?
I think we can bring in Ishtiaq Ahmed from the Bradford Council of Mosques here in the UK. We've been discussing what the British Prime Minister has said, which is basically that Muslim leaders and families need to be doing more to protect their children and to educate them more fully about the world and to avoid these situations where they go off and lose their lives fighting for Islamic State. Can you just react to, in general terms, to what he's saying?
I am very disappointed by the Prime Minister's comments. It's a failure on his part to acknowledge the tremendous work the Muslim community and the institutions have done over the years to make our community aware of the threat of radicalization and the dangers of radicalization and the danger of the rhetoric, the propaganda by organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So I think we have put a lot of effort and energy, and we continue to do that. And for Prime Minister not to acknowledge that.
Well, it sounds like you're in in denial there, I think is what a lot of people would think.
I'm not denying it. I'm saying that the community is only too aware of the threat of radicalization.
Okay, well, let me introduce Hidi Rahman, who can put her point of view to you.
I mean, I'd like to ask you a question, Mr. Ahmed. Will you publicly condemn ISIS as murderers, rapists, slavers and torturers? Will you publicly condemn them on air? And will you...
We have condemned ISIS repeatedly. I condemn ISIS and its agenda. Now on air, other people in the community, organizations, reputable organizations in the community have done similar something. It seems that our condemnation, our criticism and our work around radicalization is not being acknowledged by the media or by the government.
Kalsoom Bashir, do you have a point to put to Ishtiaq Ahmed?
I do. I think we of course all condemn what ISIS stand for, but what we have to do is to ask some very, very soul-searching questions about, other than condemnation, what are we doing? We know that there are safeguarding processes in place to protect and support vulnerable individuals once they have been radicalised, but what are we doing to stop them from getting to that stage? Are we creating those spaces within the community where young women can go with their issues, where they feel comfortable with their issues, so that they're not isolated within their own homes? What are we actually doing on a very, very practical basis? I mean, we go out to young people, to women across the country. We need the support of all community organisations. And I think if we're defining ourselves as Muslims, we must look to our faith institutions to take the lead and make those institutions open and to all young men and women, and make them places where young people can explore issues around identity, career, and ask them what they can contribute to this country.
Can I ask Hidi and Kalsoom, could you both come in on this issue of identity? When you were brought up in British Muslim communities, were you encouraged to mix with Christians and Jews?
I attended a church school when I was young, and that was a deliberate initiative from my father, because he was very much of a secular view. But I did have very much an influential Muslim teaching from my mother. So I think I saw both sides of the coin to a large degree.
Kalsoom?
Similarly, yes, I was encouraged. We were brought up in a council estate where we mixed very, very much with all our neighbours, and were encouraged to do so.
And how typical was that?
I have to say that the first seeds of alienation and recognition that perhaps there was a supremacist ideology was when I first attended the mosque, and the rhetoric around there was that we don't mix with the white devils. And I remember that quite clearly from the age of about 11. And that's the sort of rhetoric that we are challenging.
And I would agree with that, because I grew up being called a coconut for an awfully long time.
Ishtiaq Ahmed, I mean, I think this is a point that people in the UK are beginning to ask about, is to what extent are the Muslim communities, British Muslim communities, willing to integrate?
Firstly, that those are not my experiences. From a very young age, I have been encouraged my parents to actually have friends and interaction or social interaction from people from all backgrounds, Christians, Jews, Hindus. I continue to, over the last 30, 40 years, work actively around interfaith. I visit churches, I go to Gurdwaras, people come to mosques. So those are my experiences. And those are not experiences of my children or my grandchildren. Obviously, I accept and acknowledge the fact that we as a community, and particularly our faith institutions, we need to do more to open our doors and welcome and provide safe spaces for women and children and young people, and also safe spaces for people from other faith communities and those with the non-faith communities. These are community institutions which need to be able to respond to their neighborhoods and be welcoming and accommodating. A lot more work needs to be done around that, and we are actually doing that. But for the Prime Minister to basically make a very blanket judgment on the Muslim community that we are not doing enough or sufficient, I think is grossly misinformation and misrepresentation.
And that's the view of Ishtiaq Ahmed. He's spokesman for the Bradford Council of Mosques. We also heard from businesswoman Hidi Rahman and Kalsoom Bashir from the British counter-extremist organisation SKYPE.